Welcome to the EPG Pathshala Linguistics course, specifically the Morphology and Syntax paper of the course for which I am responsible. Hello, my name is Prabal Dasgupta. I work at the Indian Statistical Institute in Kolkata. What we are about to cover is a module called Revisiting Traditional Grammar. Remember, in the last module, I said that we will be developing tools from three sections: traditional grammar, structural linguistics, and generative syntax. This time, we are going to look at traditional grammar. That is the objective of this module. We begin by considering the fact that traditional grammar had a split between the ideas that they gave in their definitions of concepts like noun, verb, adjective, and the actual practice of traditional grammatical parsing, the way they analyzed the sentences and showed how the parts of speech are working and so on. So if you look at the split between theory and practice, you find that the practice of traditional grammarians was far superior to their theory. Their definitions were on the whole worthless, but their working habits were very sound, and we continue them to this day. So the struggle in structural linguistics has been how to extract the practices of traditional grammarians and turn those practices into a proper theory. That is what we are trying to do. In this module, we shall talk about, therefore, the transition from the notional way of doing grammar, a grammar based on notions or ideas, towards a better approach which is based on structure and distribution especially. For example, suppose a traditional grammar book tells you a noun is the name of a person, place, or thing. A verb is a word expressing activity. An adjective is a word denoting a quality. These are fairly ordinary definitions that you will find in book after book when you look at traditional grammar. These definitions are of no use at all, because if you're looking for a word for quality, you don't always look for an adjective like rapid. You also look at a noun like rapidity. Rapidity expresses a quality of being rapid, but it's a noun, not an adjective. Likewise, when you're looking for a word expressing an activity, you may, of course, look at the word conquer. The verb conquer expresses an activity, but you can also look at the noun conquest. Conquest and conquer express the same activity, except that conquer is a verb and conquest is a noun. The result of looking at these examples is that you can quickly convince yourself that defining a verb in terms of activity or defining an adjective in terms of quality is completely useless. You have not even begun to tell us what an adjective is or what a verb is. Compared to these notional definitions that you find abundantly in the books of traditional grammar, their actual practice is very sound. What they do when they deal with adjectives is they look at the degrees of comparison. They give you fast, faster, fastest. And they basically tell you an adjective is a word that can go from positive to comparative and superlative. In other words, from fast you can go to faster and fastest. But from a word like slowness, which is a noun expressing a quality, you cannot say slowerness or slowestness. You also cannot say slownesser or slownessest. A noun expressing a quality does not undergo comparison. An adjective does undergo comparison. So the question is not whether an adjective expresses quality. The question is, does it undergo comparison? Likewise, if you want to know whether something is a noun in English, you want to know, can it appear next to an article like the or a? Does it take a plural ending? That kind of question. If you want to know if it's a verb, does it take ing at the end? These are the questions people really ask in the practices of traditional grammar when they really try to diagnose something as being a noun or an adjective or a verb. What we do in modern linguistics, starting with structural linguistics and continuing into generative syntax, is extract the best practices from traditional grammar and develop them into a theory. Traditional grammar had a notional theory which was on the whole useless, and it had very healthy distributional practices which depend on noting where a particular element is found, in what kind of neighborhood, what else is found around it, which is a distributional question. Our efforts, starting with structuralism and continuing in the generative period, have focused on these distributional practices, which are the basis of present-day theory. We begin our work by classifying the constructions we spoke of in the last module into three types. The types of construction are headed constructions called endocentric versus headless constructions called exocentric. And then among the endocentric constructions which have heads, there are subordinating constructions that have one head and a dependent versus coordinating constructions that have 2, 3 or more heads and no dependents. We are then left with three types of constructions: exocentric, subordinating, coordinating. It's fairly easy to remember because exocentric has no head, subordinating has one head, and coordinating has 2 or more heads. All the examples you have considered so far are of the type called subordinating within the larger class called endocentric. So everything you have looked at where a verb has a complement that it governs the case of, or an adjective noun construction, all those things are subordinating endocentric constructions. We now want you to look at coordinating endocentric constructions like Raka and Dinesh. Raka and Dinesh has 2 heads, the head Raka and the head Dinesh. Sandwiched between the 2 heads is the coordinating conjunction and. And is neither a head nor a dependent. It is what is known as a marker of the construction. What is a marker? It is a functor that takes the task of putting the construction together. Remember that functors perform that kind of task. One of the jobs of functors is to put constructions together, to construct the constructions. Instead of Raka and Dinesh, of course you can get more heads. You can say Raka, Alita, Umesh and Dinesh, and when you do that you have 4 heads and 1 marker. You will have no difficulty, I'm sure, understanding endocentric constructions of these 2 kinds, the subordinating kind that you've seen lots of examples of and this coordinating kind. But I'm sure it is a puzzle to you that linguists have decided that there are some exocentric constructions that have no head at all. Why, you must be wondering, do we classify some constructions as exocentric? Let us look at an example to address your puzzlement. Consider the sentence, babies gurgle. Gurgling is that weird little noise that babies make all the time with their mouth before they begin to talk. Why is the sentence babies gurgle exocentric? Why do linguists say that the noun babies is not the head and the verb gurgle is not the head? Therefore, the sentence has no head at all. Your reason for wondering why this is being said does not concern the definition of head that we have given. You are worried about something else. You're worried about the fact that head-dependent relations are marked by some syntactic linkage like agreement and government. You can see that in the sentence babies gurgle, there is an agreement linkage between the subject babies and the predicate gurgle. So you're worried about how our theory holds together. We understand your worry, but let us patiently address the problem step by step. Let us begin and see whether the term head applies either to babies or to gurgle. Remember, in any constitute, the head is that constituent whose distribution is like the distribution of the whole constituent. Does babies have the same kind of distribution as the whole constituent? Let us look at a context in which we can test the question. Consider the context, Ahmed knows that. You can say, Ahmed knows that babies gurgle. Ahmed knows that the earth is round. Ahmed knows that the earth is flat. Whatever you want to say. Any sentence can go into that context. Now, in that context, where sentences can appear, which define the distribution of sentences, we cannot say Ahmed knows that babies. You can't say that. Which shows that babies does not have the same distribution as babies gurgle. Likewise, just as you can't say Ahmed knows that babies, you also cannot say Ahmed knows that gurgle. Now here I can see some of you shooting up with your right hand and saying, excuse me, but it is in fact possible to say Ahmed knows that gurgle. Fair enough. You can indeed say Ahmed knows that gurgle, Ahmed knows this gurgle, where this and that are demonstratives which depend on the head gurgle, where gurgle is a noun. In this exercise, we are testing whether gurgle from the sentence babies gurgle, the verb, can occur in Ahmed knows that blank. Can it occur in that blank? The answer is no. If you want to remove the distraction of the fact that gurgle is both a verb and a noun, and if you therefore want to test it accurately, you have to pick another kind of example in which you get a verb that does not accept use as nouns. You can say something like, Ahmed knows that mathematicians diagonalize. Now, you can test that sentence and you will find Ahmed knows that mathematicians is ungrammatical. Ahmed knows that diagonalize is ungrammatical. So you can safely conclude that Ahmed knows that dash is not a context that allows either the subject or the predicate to appear alone. So you can take that point as being safely established. Once you've established that point, we have given you a full formal answer to your worry. Do we have a demonstration that the sentence is an exocentric construction? Your worry is not that we don't have a formal demonstration completely answering your worry. Your worry is that you have an intuitive worry. You are unhappy, you are upset that the syntactic linkage between the subject and the predicate is something we are missing if we claim that the subject-predicate construction is exocentric. Because surely syntactic linkages always link a head with a dependent. How can the subject and the predicate have an agreement linkage if neither the subject nor the predicate is a head which takes the other as a dependent? That is the nature of your worry. To answer your question, what we have to say is the subject imposes its number specification on the predicate when agreement happens. You are taking this to mean that the subject is a bit like a head and the verb or the predicate is a bit like a dependent. But in the other direction, which you also need to look at, there are cases where the predicate gives orders to the subject and the subject has to obey what the predicate says. There are some marginal instances of this in English and much better examples in other languages. I'll begin with the English example. If you take the sentence, it doesn't matter that Rahim smokes cigarettes. The subject, it, in the sentence, it doesn't matter that Rahim smokes cigarettes, is a meaningless pronoun. Meaningless pronouns appear in subject position only when the predicate orders the subject to be a meaningless pronoun. In this case, the verb is matter. Matter is a verb lexically specified as being able to give that order. I'm not trying to say that matter never takes a meaningful subject. I'm saying that matter is a verb that is compatible with a meaningless subject. It can, in certain sentences, instruct the subject to be meaningless, and when it gives that instruction, the subject has to obey. Instead of saying, it doesn't matter that Rahim smokes cigarettes, you cannot say, what doesn't matter that Rahim smokes cigarettes? That is ungrammatical. You need a meaningless pronoun there. If need be, you can substitute the meaningless pronoun, rearrange the sentence, and say that Rahim smokes cigarettes doesn't matter. So there is a reason why a meaningless pronoun has been placed in the subject position of such a sentence. This is one example. Better examples are available in Hindi, Urdu, and in Esperanto, where you get a certain kind of subject that is chosen by the verb or by the predicate. English doesn't really have good examples of this. But please take our word for it. You have exercises where you'll get a chance to see this in Hindi, especially in Hindi, Urdu. Therefore, take our word for the fact that not only does the subject impose agreement on the predicate also often imposes formal constraints on the subject. So the sentence is a construction with two dependents. The subject depends on the predicate, and the predicate depends on the subject. If there are two dependents, there is no absolute head of the sentence. So the sentence is headless. That is the upshot of why these constituents are mutually dependent. That is what happens in an exocentric construction, a construction that does not have a center or a head. The difficulty without telling you all this is we can predict that you will still be unhappy with the idea that a subject or a predicate cannot be called the head of the sentence, that the sentence is a construction that has no head. You are unhappy because you want there to be a head. You want there to be a center of the construction that gives orders that the rest of the construction has to listen to. That is an intuitive need you have. Your intuitive need comes from the same area in which traditional grammar used to give those notional definitions. A noun is the name of a person, place, or thing. An adjective is the name of a quality. A verb is the name of an activity. That kind of stuff. Those kinds of semi-meaningful, semi-valid, practically unusable, theoretically unsound definition with which traditional grammars filled their initial pages were to cater to this need for intuitive understanding that you have that leads you to say, how come you are calling this an exocentric construction? How can there be such a thing? What you need to get rid of is the illusion that traditional grammars give you a notional intuitive understanding. Beyond that, you have to get rid of your desire for an intuitive understanding of the nature of language. We'd better tell you at this stage, now that we're beginning syntax, there is no possibility in linguistics of your or our attaining satisfactory intuitive understanding of the nature of language. It is not a commodity that is available. You will not get it, we will not get it. Let us not hanker after something that we cannot have. The best we can hope for is a complete formal calculation where we get the calculation right and we can show that all the answers are valid when the steps of the procedures are followed. And all the parts of that formal calculation are coherent with each other. There are no breaks, no inconsistencies. We are aiming for that in linguistics. If you are aiming for something different, like an intuitive understanding, we respect your wishes and we wish you well, but we are reasonably sure that you will not succeed people have tried, people who are extremely brilliant geniuses have tried and failed in generation after generation, to the point where we think that that quest has to be abandoned. Language is too vast and too deep for a human mind to gain satisfactory intuitive understanding of it. So it is not a goal that we should have in our quest for a scientific analysis of language. This is the basic background to what we are going to do. We will try to arrive at useful formal generalizations. We will not try to give you an adequate intuitive understanding. It is not available. There is nothing we can do to help you. Now we come back to the task of updating the traditional grammar's understanding of parts of speech. As we have already told you, what really happens in traditional grammar practices, which were much healthier than their theoretical definitions, was that we diagnose something as a verb when we can see that it expresses tense, mood, and other verbal inflectional categories. We diagnose something as a noun when we find that the noun takes part in a declension showing case, number, gender, and other nominal inflectional categories. We diagnose something as an adjective when it presents the external signs of adjectival inflectional categories, such as agreement with the noun in a richly inflected language, or at least inflection for comparative and superlative degree in a less richly inflected language like English. These are the signs we are looking for in order to detect whether something is a noun or a verb or an adjective. We are not looking for elusive signs of something being a quality word, a name word, or an activity word. That criterion does not help us to distinguish between assassination, a noun, and assassinate, a verb. So those are not criteria that we can use in our practice as grammarians. The traditional grammarians had excellent practices. Those were distributional. Those asked, what kind of company does this word keep? In precisely which environment is this word found? The answer was nouns are found in the environment of case marking. Verbs are found in the environment of tense marking. That was the basic diagnostic criterion that allowed us to pull out the nouns and pull out the verbs. Let us consider an example from pronouns. Some of you are familiar with the Indian grammatical tradition, and you know that pronouns in India are called sarvanama. The reason why they are called sarvanama, many people assume, is that pronouns can refer to everybody, therefore it is universal, it's a notional idea. That is not the point. The point is that the word sarva in Sanskrit had a declension which is a typical pronominal declension. So you get sarvasmai, tasmai, kasmai, etasmai, and so on. This typical sma in the middle of the declensional form is a diagnostic for saying, aha, this is a declension of the sarva type. So a sarvanama is actually a nama that behaves like the word sarva. This is a distributional definition in ancient India. I don't just mean that ancient Indians were doing this. I'm also saying that in the traditions of Greek and Latin grammar, people were doing the same thing. All that we need to do is follow that healthy streak in the classical traditions. Once you've done that, you can get back to distributional work and begin healthy syntactic learning. Let us now come to the idea that a sentence is an exocentric construction. Let us, like in the last few modules, turn to the data of the artificial language Esperanto, which is particularly neat and so on. You have already been told that Esperanto verbs don't show person, number, gender, and they don't take part in agreement. That's fine. But the Esperanto predicate, if it has a verb to be plus an adjective or a participle, the predicate shows agreement. If you take a sentence like, La knabo estas alta, the boy is tall, you get alta, singular adjective, agreeing with knabo, singular noun. If you turn those into plural, you get the boys are tall coming out as La knaboj estas altaj. In English, the predicate agrees with the subject, the boys, at the point of the verb. You get the boys are tall rather than the boy is tall. In Esperanto, the predicate agrees with the subject at the point of the adjective. You get La knabo estas alta and La knaboj estas altaj. Likewise, if you go to a participle like kuranta, running, you get La knabo estas kuranta, the boy is running, and La knaboj estas kurantaj, the boys are running, where the participle kuranta agrees with the boy for number. Notice that it's written with the letter J, as in the International Phonetic Alphabet. Now, the second part of our understanding that the sentence is exocentric has to do with the predicate telling the subject what to do. You can show this from Esperanto quite clearly. In order to say in Esperanto, you decide what you like, I don't care, you can say two different kinds of sentences. You can have a direct sentence with a nominative subject, such as mi ne zorgos, I, negation, will care, meaning I will not care, pri viaj decidoj, about your decisions. In that sentence, mi is a nominative subject, it's a direct subject of the kind that you're used to from English and so on. The alternative is you can say, al mi estas egale kion vi decidas. To me is equal what you decide. Literally, to me is equal what you decide. That's bad in English, but it's perfect Esperanto. Al mi estas egale kion vi decidos is Esperanto for to me is equal what you decide, which is another way of saying I don't care what you decide. So in Esperanto, zorgos, the active verb care, takes a subject which is nominative. You get mi ne zorgos or mi zorgos, I will care, I will not care. Whereas the predicate estas egale, is equal, takes a dative subject in Esperanto. You get al mi estas egale, to me is equal, meaning I'm okay either way. It doesn't matter to me. Dative subjects appear in Hindi, Urdu, and in Esperanto. They don't appear in English. Dative subjects are chosen by the predicate. So what we've been doing this for is to convince you that Esperanto data, Hindi, Urdu data, and data from other languages that have dative subjects, Hindi, Urdu also has ergative subjects, suffice to show that the predicate often gives instructions that the subject has to follow. Therefore, the subject is dependent on the predicate, you see. Since the subject is dependent on the predicate for these special kinds of subjects, and the predicate is dependent on the subject when it shows agreement either on the adjective or on the verb, you can see that there is dependency in both directions of the sentence as a construction. Therefore, we have two dependents, and when we have two dependents, it makes no sense to say that we have a head, because the head-dependent relation is flowing in both directions in this case. That is why we refuse to call an exocentric construction headed. Or to put it differently, that's why we refuse to call the sentence an endocentric construction. Now that you've seen that Hindi, Urdu data and Esperanto data converge on deciding that the sentence should be treated as exocentric, we can now turn to the part of our module where you familiarize yourself with the basic constructions that are at the heart of the system of syntax. These basic constructions were already noted in classical antiquity in the major grammatical traditions of the ancient world in India, China, Greece, Rome, the Arab countries, and so on. We use them to this day. They have stood us in good stead, and there is no reason to abandon them. One basic construction is the verb-object construction, in which the object is marked with the accusative case. Esperanto has a particularly clear accusative case ending, the letter N, which is invariant. So if you compare the English sentence, they know you, with the Esperanto equivalent, ili konas vin, you notice that since Esperanto vin, accusative, distinguishes itself from vi, nominative, it becomes a bit easier to morphologically mark the verb-object construction in Esperanto. English morphology does distinguish certain accusative pronouns from their nominative counterparts. Me, us, him, her, them are distinct from I, we, he, she, they. But Esperanto does it consistently, being a streamlined language. Why does it matter that the object of a verb has accusative case? Because you see, there are certain verbs that take a nominative noun after them. For example, when you have a sentence like, Rasika was the president. In Esperanto, Rasika estis la presidento, with an O at the end, not ON. The constituent, the president or la presidento, is not an object of the verb was or Esperanto estis. It is what we call a complement. A complement is like an object. What is different about a complement is that it doesn't bear accusative case. In this example, it bears nominative case. All objects are complements, but not all complements are objects. So when you're talking about a complement that is not an object, you call it a complement. So this is one important distinction between verb-object constructions and verb-complement constructions. One aspect of complements is that the complement does not have to be a noun, though it can be a noun in the nominative case. If you take she is clever, Esperanto she estas lerta, you will see that the verb takes an adjective complement, English clever, Esperanto lerta. The verb can also take a prepositional phrase as a complement, as in she is no longer among us, where the prepositional phrase among us is the complement of the verb is. Esperanto counterpart, ci ne plu estas inter ni, where inter ni, among us, is the complement of estas, is. So we have seen examples so far of verb object and verb complement. Actually, we've seen a third construction, preposition complement. Prepositions also take a complement. And we've noted that the complement of a verb can itself be a prepositional phrase within which the preposition takes a complement. Now, when you take a basic sentence like babies gurgle, if you expand the predicate, you get babies drink milk, where drink is a verb and milk is an object. So you've got this endocentric construction, drink milk, inside the exocentric construction, babies drink milk. Throughout these examples, we have distinguished between two kinds of things. It is now time to pay attention to the fact that we have done so. We had parts of speech concepts, noun, verb, adjective, preposition, conjunction, and so on. We had function concepts, complement, object, subject, predicate. These are functions. These are not parts of speech. Notice that the same function can be fulfilled by different parts of speech. John was the president. President, part of speech, noun, and it fulfills the function complement. John is clever. Clever, part of speech, adjective, function, complement. John is not among us. Among us is headed by among, part of speech, preposition, function, complement, complement of the verb. This shows that you need to systematically distinguish the categories which are called parts of speech and the functions. A noun or pronoun or a preposition phrase can take on the subject function. A predicate can be either a verb alone or a verb and a noun or a verb and an adjective. When you're talking about functions, some people use the term grammatical relation instead. Don't get hung up on terminology. These are equivalent notions. There are other functions to look at when you're getting a basic map of this part of town. You need to understand that adjectives modify their nouns, and therefore there is a modifier function. In the tall man, the adjective tall modifies the noun man. If you want to be very finicky and precise, some grammarians make a distinction between modifiers and intensifiers. In the very tall man, they say very is not a modifier of tall, very is an intensifier of tall, and tall is a modifier of man. There is a reason for this. There are some languages in which intensifiers are morphologically different from modifiers, but we don't really have to go into this in that kind of detail in this part of the basic course. While we are talking about modifiers, let us introduce you to two kinds of modifying clauses. There are relative clauses that you've heard about in school, but at school they may not have told you that there is a distinction between restrictive relative clauses and appositive relative clauses. So let us do that for you now. The same words strung together but used slightly differently can give you a relative clause of the restrictive kind or a relative clause of the appositive kind. Suppose you say the Greeks, comma, who were philosophical, comma, asked fundamental questions. This is an appositive relative clause, by which we mean that you're saying the Greeks asked fundamental questions, and by the way, the Greeks were philosophical. You have this other clause in apposition with the rest of the structure. In contrast, when you say the Greeks who were philosophical asked fundamental questions, you're saying, by using the restrictive relative clause who were philosophical without a comma, you're saying there were two kinds of Greeks. There was one kind, those Greeks were philosophical and they asked fundamental questions. There was another kind, those Greeks were not philosophical and they didn't ask any questions at all. So the meaning, as you see, is quite different. When you have an appositive relative, you're talking about all the Greeks. When you have a restrictive relative, the purpose of the relative is to restrict which Greeks you are talking about rather than other Greeks. This is another aspect of modifier structures that you need to know about. One further point to cover is that in your traditional grammar learning, you must have heard about articles like the English definite article the and the English indefinite article a or an. You see, in structural and generative work, we have slightly moved away from that notion of article because we hesitate to say that the and an really belong to the same category. On the contrary, words like this and that in what is that cactus doing here, which were called demonstrative adjectives in traditional grammar, are today not called adjectives at all because they are not mutually substitutable with real adjectives like horrible or happy or awful. What we say today is that this and that are like they are determiners. Demonstratives and the definite article are both subtypes of determiners. Now the indefinite element an is complicated. In some contexts we get the impression that it behaves a little bit like numbers, numerals. An apple behaves a lot like two apples, but there are other contexts where that doesn't really work. The general consensus seems to be that indefinite a or an is really an indefinite quantifier. In other words, it has the same class affiliation as the words some or all or every or much or any. So these are among the points on which we have moved away from traditional grammar. The last and very important point is that present-day linguistic theory makes a lot of use of the notion of auxiliary, which used to be called auxiliary verbs. Nowadays, most people just call them auxiliaries and shorten the word to aux, A-U-X. Auxiliaries are elements like will, can, must, shall, etc. in English. and they take part in the verbal complex. At this stage of our revisiting traditional grammar, it is sufficient material for you to digest, and we probably have reached the point at which summarizing sounds like a good idea. So to summarize this module, we began by emphasizing what we all like about traditional grammar and what we don't really like about it. All modern linguists are deeply appreciative of the healthy practices of the traditional grammarians in their description of linguistic realities. They were very good at diagnosing the important problems and how to tackle them, and they did it very well. They were hopeless at public relations. They did not know how to talk about their own work. When they presented their work, they gave definitions, and the definitions were often very bad. Why were they bad? Because they were trying to give the public the illusion of an intuitive understanding, where in fact language doesn't allow us the luxury of a satisfactory intuitive understanding. We have to remain content with an abstract and remote formal understanding of how it works. But traditional grammarians were hoping for more. It's an understandable hope, but that led them to write these definitions that nobody can use. So what we like about traditional grammar is their practices, and those practices are distributional. So in structural linguistics and generative syntax, we've been trying to sharpen the tools that were actually being used on the ground by traditional grammarians. We're trying to turn them into concepts, into the foundations of a theory of syntax. That is the basic task today. On the way to that task, we begin by classifying constructions into 3 types, depending on the number of heads in the construction type. We have 0 heads in exocentric constructions, 1 head in subordinating endocentric constructions, and 2 or more heads in coordinating endocentric constructions. This led us to a discussion of what a head is, and we gave a quick distributional definition of head. And we spent a lot of time explaining to you the rationale for classifying the sentence as a construction that is exocentric, that has no head at all. If you want to use the logic of head and dependent, you have to say that a sentence has 2 dependents and therefore no head at all. We explained why this is the case by giving evidence from several languages. Finally, we took you on a guided tour through the basic constructions that traditional grammar had identified and some basic functions that play a role in putting those constructions together. That is what we did in this module. Please make sure that you look up the e-text and make sure that you follow up any supplementary reading that has been suggested in this and other modules. It's a good idea to read as well as listen. And please get back to us if you have questions or criticisms. Thank you for your attention.